Welcome to DOS Phone Hunt. I'm Jean-Pierre Ruth for Information Week. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at what we're calling, who are the AI heroes? Oftentimes, we hear about potential risks, concerns, potentially questionable practices that are out there in the AI sphere as the technology continues to evolve and, fill the public interest. And admittedly, I have my own reservations about AI that I, tend to bring up from time to time. But rather than just talking about those concerns and things that are making people kind of clench up, this episode we're going to be taking a look at, what are some of the positive examples that we're seeing in the AI spectrum, ideas about best practices, and speak to, what seems to be going right. And who seems to be putting things in terms of looking at privacy, being attentive to regulation, putting those things at the forefront with what they're doing when it comes to AI. And once again, I'm always glad to be joined by experts who are more knowledgeable in these topics than I am. And in this particular episode, I'm joined by Octavian Udrea, Chief Scientist with Code Metal, Kjell Carlsson, Head of AI Strategy with Domino Data Lab, and Sohrob Kazerounian, Distinguished AI Researcher with Vectra AI. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making yourselves available for this.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, great. All right, so let's talk about, I guess the big part of this that has to be kind of really addressed, I guess, at the top. Does AI have to be the bad guy, when it comes to, training on data or potentially using content questionably with or without permission in order to be innovative and useful? And Octavian, I was hoping you could kind of give your perspective on that.
The answer is definitely no, and I'll try to explain the other side of that coin too. But there are plenty of examples of AI that with clear positive societal impact. And just to name a few things, things like fighting climate change. There's a recent project that is looking at the coral reefs, right, monitored through camera images to try to find solutions to that impending problem. There's healthcare diagnostics. We know that AI, in terms of reading X-rays, can greatly complement what diagnosticians can do. There are others like advisors for agriculture and what crops to plant to avoid hunger situations. So wherever there is wealth of data in the public sphere, there's a potential for using AI to solve some of these really thorny problems of recognizing patterns and providing advice and directions and analysis that can have a great societal impact. Now, there's a pattern to all of those that I mentioned, which is they're all kind of specialized AIs, right? So on the other side, you have these efforts to try to build essentially AGI. We're not quite there yet, and I kind of hesitated using the word as a scientist because we're very far away, I think, still. And when you try that, then by the nature of things, you have to absorb huge amounts of data. So it's the financial incentives are to absorb as much data as you can, whether the controls are in place for that data in terms of copyright and privacy and so on or not, because it's very expensive to kind of sift through all that data to figure out what you could use and couldn't use. So in the path to that lofty goal, sometimes we've seen approaches that have kind of treaded on the ability to use proper controls for privacy and copyright. Now, the good news there is I think that the hope there is as the world becomes more aware of that, like it happened with software licenses, for instance, things are going to become more automated so that we can easily avoid content where we would tread on somebody's rights when we train AI.
Fantastic. All right, awesome. I appreciate your input on that. Okay, thank you. All right.
I guess jumping in on this,
Sure.
it's one of those things where I know this might sound idealistic, but we really also should point out the opportunities to leverage AI really to be more ethical ourselves. I mean, you hear people complain about when it comes to AI that AI is not explainable, or it's unreliable, or hallucinates, or issues like that. And I mean, have you tried people? Have you looked at people? I mean, we come up with explanations for our own behavior, but it's usually not based on anything related to how we actually made those decisions in the first place. And when it comes to our putting guardrails and testing our own behavior, I mean, you usually can't for good ethical reasons. Versus when it comes to these models, we have the ability to use them to go in and identify our own biases, our own to test them, to make them more reliable, to go in and assess them for not just one type of fairness, but multiple fairness, different dimensions. There's really an unexplored opportunity to go in and actually improve our own individual behavior as well as organizational behavior around this. So it's, yes, there are definitely challenges, and we need to work on them, and it's usually through better governance. But it's one where let's not miss out on the opportunity here. This is one of the best opportunities we have in order to actually improve our existing flawed behavior as people.
There is
Definitely.
actually an argument to be made that it may be that only by taking the idea of ethics and AI seriously do we even get to a point where you can have large language models, right? So if you remember the chatbot Microsoft out some time ago, Tay, right? Within 24 hours, they found that it's spewing racist, sexist, demagoguery or whatever. And you can't have a product as a company that tends to veer into that direction, right? And so by taking the idea seriously that we need to find ways to actually guardrail, constrain, nudge the behavior, align it with human values, it's only by taking that seriously that you get to the place where you can train LLMs now in a way that you can feel confident putting it out there, releasing it to the public, and so on.
Well, I think the wonderful thing about Tay is sort of it emphasizes the importance of understanding human behavior, because the way that they were able to turn Tay into a racist, sexist chatbot within minutes was because, of course, people went in and hacked it and trained it to go in and say those kinds of things. And so really there's a meta point here in understanding how you govern your AI solutions and how you design them so that they function effectively. Start with understanding people.
Speaking of governing things, Kjell, actually, with the next question, so we can lead with that, and we definitely want to get back to some of the elements you just spoke on. Kjell, how much scrutiny seems to be on the way for AI? At the state, be it the national or even international levels. We have some already, but what else seems to be coming down the road for us?
I mean, it certainly does feel like there's a tsunami of regulation coming. And obviously, the EU AI Act gets a lot of the attention because of just how large those fines are. 7% of global revenue if you are falling afoul of those prohibited use cases. But the same thing is happening in a different form here in the US. I think the National Conference of State Legislatures went in and tallied them up. And in 2024, there were 45 regulations and proposals that were submitted in 45 different states. And I think 31 of them implemented them. However, there's a question of to what degree are those going to be effective? There's going to be, without a doubt, a conflicting patchwork of regulations that are coming, and it's going to affect ever more organizations. But I would argue that really the scrutiny where it's actually coming from and where it's most important coming from is by organizations themselves. These traditional machine learning and generative AI based use cases are now just so much more important for organizations. There's so many more of them. They're happening in more parts of the organization that organizations are waking up to the fact that they need to provide governance around this, both because of potential risks, whether that be the business risks, the ethical risks, legal risks, etc., but also because this is so core to being able to innovate and actually leverage and implement these machine learning and AI models. and say, well, unless you can govern them effectively, you can't really instill trust and drive adoption of them. And if you can't do that, when you're not really going to get much in the way of impact for them. So yes, there is definitely things that are happening on the regulatory side of things, but really where I expect most of the effective governance to happen is really by organizations themselves just doing this for very self-interested reasons, not just of not getting fined, but being able to use these and drive more impact with AI.
Now, adding on to that a little bit, because you mentioned the EU Act at the beginning, and I see that a little bit as regulation before capability, right? So I'm a EU citizen. I've spent half of my life in Europe and half in the US. And I think the EU kind of jumped the gun on that one because they regulated things that they had no capability yet in. So naturally, when that happens, governments are going to be a little bit overwhelmed by the pace of innovation. So then I think everybody will need to resist their fear of missing out on this wave and kind of be sane about regulating capabilities that we think are problematic but are impending, not things that we imagine might happen at some point in the future.
I think a case in point of this was the recent California AI law that got vetoed down. When you look at it, well, what was it going after? It's largely science fiction related catastrophic risks that we just don't have any way of actually doing right now. That threat of a new and improved biological weapon or a nuclear weapon. If you want to try and do that using an LLM today or for the next year, good luck. You're not going to make headway against that as an issue. And who are they looking to regulate? They were looking to regulate the LLM providers. Versus when you think about, well, where are the risks today? There are real risks today. I mean, fraud, cybersecurity, non-consensual pornography. Those are huge problems that are happening right now. And who is it who's driving those? Well, it's not the commercial providers of large language models, right? I mean, if you are going after and doing those, you're not building those on top of those commercial models. You're going to go use an open source model or a vendor that is not in a heavily regulated country. So a lot of these regulations are going after the wrong use cases because they don't really exist with AI today, the wrong risks, and after the wrong actors because those are the use cases that get attention, and those are the actors who are easy to regulate, which doesn't really help us in terms of making us all safer.
Though I do want to interject that this is a positive look at AI, but I do want to interject that there are some times where, not often, there seem to be folks who are pursuing elements of science fiction that have been presented as cautionary tales that seem to be the blueprint for they think is a good idea, and the rest of us are like, no, really, you should not look at that episode of Black Mirror as something that you want to emulate. Please stop. But hopefully we're, as you said, a lot of the things that are the more admittedly bombastic doom and gloom ideas that are out there, really just aren't feasible. However, I am watching very closely.
It's interesting, the dystopian scenario from Black Mirror, I think the first season maybe, where this guy has just passed away and his wife is basically able to talk to a simulated version of that person, right? And it's eerie, but we're not far off from being able to do that sort of thing, right? And I think there may even be startups starting to do, exactly those dystopian things that, on the one hand, we're warning everybody about, and on the other, sort of barreling forward and creating a world where we're, effectively going to pursue those products, models, and so on and so on. It's going to be interesting to see. I think the one other thing I would add on the regulatory aspect, I think a lot of this is going to play out also just in courts. At the number of lawsuits where you have artists suing the provider of actually models that are considered generally neutral and not used for evil or whatever. If you're replicating somebody's voice or the types of art that they would create, or if you're an author that had copyrighted material that ended up in one of these large data sets that was crawled and it's being used to train a large language model, Now anyone can write a book in your voice.
To listen to the entire conversation, look for the Das100 podcast on Spreaker, Spotify, Amazon Music, and other popular podcast platforms.